Hello, everyone. This is live in 1 minute 34 when this says I go live. uh, and at some point I'll... there we go. Great. Hello. Hello, everyone. So, as usual, it would be great to see who's here at the start. You can make some comment to let me see that you see this. That would be great. Hey, Rupert. Okay. So, oh, great. Thank you. Alrighty. So, today I wanted to dive into this business of same-sidedness. Like I called this thing, hey, David. We called this thing Same-sidedness in the Shadow. At least I think that was the title I gave this. So I want to give a bit of the context about what this is for, and then dive into the content of what I'm focusing on here. So the big picture I'm looking at is this general question of how can the human race do well? This is a puzzle I've been staring at and trying to examine for well over a decade now. And there's this there's this this ongoing challenge. Like the negative side of it is looking at all the ways that we keep messing up our context. There's the big stuff about like climate change and dumping garbage in the oceans and in the skies. We have a garbage problem in space, which is interesting. But there's an equivalent problem that shows up in things like the criminal justice system, which is ironically named, where there's a lot of overflow and inhumane conditions there. The political polarization and gridlock, now this situation with the pandemic where it seems like a lot of our systems are collapsing. So that's that's the negative side, and the fact that we keep producing things like this, and things that are frankly a lot more scary than any of those. And we don't seem to be able to do a whole lot about it, which is really strange because human beings are very inventive for the most part. We're able to solve a lot of our difficulties, but not the big ones. That's curious. I think that there's a way that we can do better. I think there's a way that we can fulfill an awful lot, but it requires a basic shift in how we orient to what problems are and how we're addressing them. So I gave a couple of weeks ago, I gave an outline of what I am seeing as 4 points. I was kind of arbitrary at that point, and I feel like there's some gaps in this, but just to revisit, the 4 points that I gave were having wise knowing about why these 4 points make sense, including the first one, developing your capacity to be with intensity, to be with sensation, to be with particularly the internally generated body sensations. In some circles, this third one can get called the unification of will. I've been focusing on what I've been calling bright desire. I made a post yesterday gesturing towards what does it mean to really enjoy life more. The intent of that is to orient your, both of these middle two, are to organize your psyche less around no, not that, and more around yes, that. It just turns out that if you take that all the way, you end up with some very interesting organizational implications. And the fourth one, I haven't really talked about yet, and that's what this session is going to be about. This question of how do you have what I've sometimes heard described as non-naive same-sidedness? How do we get along? There's a skill set associated with that, but the skill set is a little bit different than you might think. Now, notice that in here, it's not very clear where exactly understanding of memes falls in. Like that's, I think, in the first one. But like, it's not clear. It's not obvious. And there's a question about, well, where does pausing come into play? The ability to just pause and look. It's kind of ambiguously spread across all of them. So this is like my attempt to take a coherent thing I'm seeing and break it into a few points. And I may come up with other drafts later, I probably will. When it comes to same-sidedness, there's this puzzle that keeps showing up over and over and over again, which I could summarize as saying it's really easy to get along with people that you like when they're being nice, according to the way that your own internal system functions. So I've been part of lots of groups that focus on what's called authentic relating, or closely adjacent to that with circling, people involved with nonviolent communication. There's this sort of cluster that's loosely associated with the hippie aesthetic, I'll say, where there's all this focus on being open-hearted, connecting from the heart, feeling into what resonates, having this deep sense of like, I see you and I see you seeing me, and there's so much connection here. Those spaces can be very lovely, and they can be soaked in bullshit. there's this phenomenon, and I've encountered quite a lot in nonviolent communication flavored groups. Not universally and not all the time, but it shows up enough to be notable, where groups that focus on, well, how do we communicate in ways that can avoid triggering one another or are less likely to trigger one another, and that open up possibilities between us. Like if I'm arguing with my partner and we're activated, how do we sort that out? How do we come from a space of not attacking one another and making the situation worse? There's a tool set there, things like what's the term? I keep wanting to say objective, but unarguable. Say unarguable statements like, "Oh, I see you with I see your face is flushed," rather than "I see you mad." Like, you don't know if the other person's mad, but you can say, you can notice, "Well, I see that your face is flushed and that your eyes are squinting, and it has me wondering if you're angry with me." And I notice when I see that, I feel fear and anxiety and a little bit of defensiveness. So being able to communicate like that is one of the foundations of nonviolent communication. So in some nonviolent communication circles, I'll encounter people making statements like somebody's going, "Man, I'm just really upset about this situation. Like this, like the person shouldn't be doing that," and then having the person listening saying, "You know, when I hear you not owning your feelings, I feel sad." It's just, at that point, there's this urge to punch the person who's talking non-violently. And there's this important level of bullshit that's intrinsic to the reason why they spoke. So there's this value drift that keeps appearing over and over again. Again, not universally and not constantly, but it shows up enough to raise a question. How do we not just paint over with niceness, but how do we actually deal with the cases where there's some meaningful friction, where there's some sense of feeling attacked, where you feel like you can't get along with the other person? That's the interesting part. Right? Not getting along where everybody feels nice and huggy and like this is such an open space and it feels so connected, but how do we come from a space of being same-sided when we feel separate? When somebody is putting forward ideas that we really disagree with, that we find frightening. Okay? So that's the challenge. Right? In the announcement for this post, I pointed out an example of how Timothy Leary and his friends weren't able to meet up with this challenge. I think that part of it is that there's this inspiration about what is possible. I think that there's a way where a lot of the people who have had this kind of vision, there's a way that we could all get along. I think there's something true about it, but it's forgetting a really important dimension of the human experience. The dimension of having teeth. And the dimension where there's there's clearly a drive to manipulate. I don't mean that all people want to manipulate everybody else, but I mean that there's an emergent desire that keeps showing up to coerce other people into meeting our needs. It's just part of the background. And if we pretend that it's not there, or if we pretend that it's bad, wrong, that we just need to suppress it, we need to transcend it, I mean. We're going to love ourselves enough that we can open up to the bliss of our natural being and just relax and be vulnerable. And if that's all we're coming from, then there's a whole dimension of the human experience that we are sort of pretending isn't there. It becomes good and proper to pretend that it's not there. And then we have an interesting problem, which is that anytime somebody is triggered, anytime somebody is upset, or anytime somebody has a manipulative habit that shows up, we run into this problem of the culture encouraging us to like pretend as though it's coming from a compassionate space. Pretend as though it's not there. So again, this is not universal and it's not constant, but it's a pressure that's present. Right? It's a really curious force that seems to be really valuable to attend to. Because if we can't address the parts where we actually are pissed at the other person, where we actually see our boundaries being crossed, where we actually, like if you've ever interacted with an actual narcissist. Our culture loves using the term narcissist as basically an insult that we fling around. I don't like what that person is doing. They're kind of self-obsessed. They're a narcissist. This dilutes the term in an important way. If you've ever interacted with somebody with narcissistic personality disorder, God forbid if you've dated one, there's something dangerous about interacting with them. Okay? Same thing with psychopathy. And there are questions around what's called the dark triad: psychopathy, narcissism, and Machiavellianism. But interacting with those kinds of forces, being vulnerable and open with your heart and just kind of leaning in is a kind of naivety that will get you destroyed and often have to spend a long time recovering from it. So given these forces that we might want to call dark forces, what do we do? How do we actually get along? Yeah. So I want to emphasize, I think I said this in the announcement, I don't claim to have a complete answer. But I think that I have a couple of pieces that look to me like they're going to be part of whatever a functional answer is going to be. So I wanted to share some of those here. It comes in two large chunks. One of them has to do with a skill set that I think that a lot of people who are involved in, if you knew the terms I was saying before about the authentic relating, circling, nonviolent communication, then I think that you probably have clear hints about the tool type. I think that there's an important tweak to make about how to use those tools. And if I have space and time in this video, then I'll touch on them. If not, I'll make a different video on it. That has to do with the question of uncorruptibility. How do we make our will coherent enough that we don't drift off into using nonviolent communication passive-aggressively, for instance? Well, surely it's just all those other people, right? The main focus I wanted to attend to for this session, for this particular video, is the other arc. So there's a question of what is the skill set? The skill set that actually creates openness for there to be a bridge, a way to feel same-sidedness. But there's another side that has to do with what do you do about what we could, for lack of a better term, refer to as dark forces. I don't just mean bad actors, but I mean these places where, well, what happens when the other person is being really unreasonable? You don't need to date a narcissist to encounter some behaviors on the part of a spouse that lean narcissistic. It turns out that all egos have a narcissistic streak. It's just part of how we function. Narcissism is sort of an extreme case of a particular way that egos try to attend to themselves in order to preserve the organism. So I'm thinking of, for instance, I've heard there's a particular story type. I don't know why it is that most of the friends that I've encountered who have this story are female with a male partner who is doing a kind of pattern like this. But more than once I've heard a story that goes something like, the woman in this case, I don't claim it's always women, but in all the cases I've encountered, it's been women. The woman will feel some sort of tension or discomfort in in their environment. One person I'm thinking of needed to block out light in the bedroom in order to deal with an ongoing sleep problem. Another was trying to deal with the way that her husband's smoking patterns would fill their house with smoke. Like there's like a common kind of pattern here. Or sorry, the common effect is there's some sort of thing in the environment that is uncomfortable, that requires cooperation on the part of the husband. And when approaching the husband, experiencing a kind of dismissal. Oh, that's not a problem. Just get over it. Okay, well, like, I am having a sleep problem. I get over it by sleeping, right? Like, I don't know how to get over having smoke in my house. Like, there's a mechanical issue where there's difficulty getting through some kind of defensive barrier. And when the woman would take action to deal with the situation, the husband would undo the actions, like putting up some kind of blackout curtains or tin foil on the windows or something like that, and the husband just comes and takes them down. So when encountering patterns like that, where if the rest of the context actually has a lot of care and support, but you're encountering these glitches where there's a lot of room to get really mad and upset, like the default thing that happens is the relationship breaks down. So what do? Our culture, as it currently is, doesn't have good answers for this. It oscillates between, oh, like just really like be tender to the person's needs and open up to them and really listen. And one of the problems that in all the patterns I'm thinking of that I have specific examples of is that telling the wife to listen more doesn't help. So there's like this question of, well, what do you do? Like, how do I deal with it? And then the other side is, oh, what an asshole, dump him, end of marriage, like clearly he doesn't care about you. I think there's a reason why we have such a high divorce rate in the United States, for instance. We don't have a way of supporting how to deal with when there is a meaningful friction between personalities. So in these cases, there's a basic formula that I take as a background thing. I'll describe the formula. It's not that complicated. It's hard to use when I just describe it. Maybe that's what the skill set is about. But I think it's important to have this context. And then as you sort of feel into it and you sort of understand how this thing works, it sort of lets the rest of that fourfold pattern I was describing, it sort of helps the whole thing to make more sense about how it can work, how it can create more of a system for the human race and for your own life to create good things. So the essence of it is, instead of just being stuck on the inside of your own experience, notice that this involves that second element of being trapped by the attempt to get away from the difficulties of your own sensations. Instead, sorry, not instead, as well. Like, it's important that you are experiencing the suffering. But also notice that if you and the other person could both see the entire system that both of you are contained in, this is just a claim that pops out of the game theory from what I can tell, both of you would want to cooperate to get both of your needs met. Because the synergy between you can better meet each of your needs, not just the sum total, but like sorting out, like, you can do better if people are helping you meet your needs. And if you're doing so in a way that if you're contributing to the interaction that helps other people meet their needs, this creates a reciprocal loop that builds things. This is the foundation of human society. It's why we evolved empathy. It's why we're a social species. This turns out to be an evolutionary advantage in a systematic way that's over on top of what, for instance, cats or snakes can do. So the issue is basically that when there is a threat to what you care about, the capacity to see the system breaks down. So if you can notice that there is a foundational way in which, in fact, you would be on the same side if you could both see clearly what's going on. Then there's a level at which you can imagine, you can lean into, that you too, even in the conflict, even in the seeming disrespect or blatant disrespect, even in the friction itself is an expression of the best that both of you currently know how to do in the effort to support the system that helps each of you meet your needs. Now, that doesn't mean that it's accessible, but if you can start with that assumption, then there's a way to create a bridge, even in trigger, even in upset. This doesn't mean that you naively trust the other, but it does mean that you have room to be able to explore how might we come from the sense of, oh, we are both really upset with each other. How can we work together to look at this upset like it's a thing outside of us? It might turn out the answer is that you can't from where you are, but rather than assuming that, you ask the question and you hold the question. Right? So that's the essential formula. Just, oh, is there a way that we can come from same-sidedness here? Not you trying to make the other person do it, but you taking it for yourself. Okay. David's asking, assume the other person has the best interest of the system at heart? Yes, but implicitly. Like, I would say the same thing about my cats. The interaction between me and my cats implicitly has it so that they would, if they could understand, they would want to care for the entire system they're embedded in. I also think that it's important to notice that cats don't have the cognition capacity, as far as I know, to be able to understand the whole system. So what it means to be same-sided is not a claim about the cognitive content of the cat. It is a description of the dynamic between beings. Right? That in general, cooperation tends to produce better effects in the long run, and usually in the short run as well, with some important caveats. It gets turbulent and complicated in the short run, but in the long run, there is an important incentive for all beings to, in some extended definition, get along. So I'm saying noticing that fact about the environment, and therefore an inability to coordinate to meet one another's needs is a matter of skill, not a matter of inherent nature. I mean, there's a way that we sort of slip in an essentialist way of operating, like that person is a jerk. What does that mean? Right? There is no essence of jerkness that is fundamental to reality, but it can feel that way when you're looking at like a spouse who just rips down your attempts to block out sunlight and says, you don't have a problem, get over it. Like, how about I eat your face? Like, the rage is understandable, and I'm not saying the rage is bad. Like, that's really important. I want to touch on the dimensions of shadow and rage and the desire to kill and destroy. That's a very important part of what it means to coordinate, what it means to cooperate. But there's a foundational way in which I think what it means to be in the same reality is that you are part of the same system with other beings, and that your flourishing is based on not just other beings meeting your needs, but other beings flourishing. When that's clear, when that's not just an abstraction, it's not just a thing that you believe, but it's something you see clearly, then any friction you encounter is a sign of a lack of current skill. And it's an invitation to expand skill. Right? So that's the level at which I mean that, yeah, they have the best interests of the system at heart. It's more like they have the best interests of the system at body. And the more attuned and intelligent a given organism is, the more capacity they have to recognize that. Which is part of why it's humans' responsibility to care for cats rather than just getting mad at the cat for not doing what you want it to do. So humans have this capacity much more than cats do. Okay, so there's a lot to say about, there's an important conversation that relates to a lot of the things that have been brought up over the last few days, and I think over the last couple of weeks as well, when I bring up this stuff about lean into joy. Lean into what you truly want. See if you can come from a yes motivation rather than a no, not that motivation. Primarily, not exclusively, but primarily. There's a common objection set. There are things that you have to do. Like, you can't just make life a bed of roses, and even if you could, roses have thorns. You just need to deal with stuff. Some stuff you have to deal with even if you don't like. Objections like, well, what about discipline? It sure seems like discipline is a good thing. I don't want to give up discipline. Aren't you just going to aren't you just going to roll around in hedonism? I don't mean to dismiss these concerns. And I think that there's an important conversation to have about them. I think that they make sense on the inside, and I think they don't make sense on the outside. Getting that to reconcile is important. There's something similar here. What happens if you are dealing with an actual narcissist? How do you get same-sided with an actual narcissist? That's hard. That's really hard. It's like a really super smart cat that doesn't give a fuck. Okay, now what? So at this point, what I want to do is dive a little bit more deeply into this question that I keep gesturing towards about the shadow. There is a problem about how we orient to what we consider wrongness. There's an illusion. One way of articulating this is that there's a thing in environmentalism where there'll be this phrase. It stuck in my head the first time I saw it because it really rung with something really interesting. Before you throw it away, remember, there is no away. Okay? Now, I think there's something distorted about that message because it's trying to communicate a thing through guilt, which I think creates a mentally shattering force. It doesn't, it sort of invites you to notice something by making you feel bad about not noticing it. I mean, there's another solution, which is to avoid the whole topic. And that's what a lot of minds do. They react to things like, I don't want to be lectured. Okay, let me not pay attention to that. Or, but I'm already doing the virtuous thing. I'm already earning my existence. And it's like, I think all of that is sad because it's leaning into a very painful way of being that I don't think is necessary. But I think the core idea has a lot of value. What really struck me about it was the way that I saw this over as a sign over a garbage can. And when I stared at that, and I went, well, I'm not going to hold on to this. I forget exactly what it was, but it's like some piece of garbage. I'm not going to hold on to this for the rest of my life. I don't know what else to do with it. Boop. You just drop it in there anyway. But something pinged about, I noticed that there's an emotional relationship that I have with this object where I've thrown it away and now it's out of my universe. It's like it doesn't exist anymore. And then this problem of, oh, well, we have this problem with overfilling landfills and we're running out of space for landfills, or so I'm told, I don't know. And it's a problem, but it's funny how the problem is abstract. Like, it's not directly connected to the act of dropping the trash in the trash can by default. Like, I can add, it's not difficult to mentally remember, like, oh yeah, sure, I'm doing this, I'm putting the trash in the trash can. And if I think about it, sure, I know that goes to a dump. And I also know this other fact that the dumps are getting full. At least I think I know that fact. There's a lot of propaganda out there. It's hard to know what's true and what's not at this point. But there isn't an emotional connection by default. There's a way where a part of my emotional system just believes that there is an in my universe and an out of my universe. And I can push things out of my universe. I'm pretty sure I inherited this attitude. It may have a biological component. I'm not quite sure why, but there's something interesting about the way that I observe what looks like the same sort of collective psychological behavior when we are talking about criminals. We talk about putting criminals away It's telling, isn't that? I mean, we even sometimes call them trash, right? Taking out the trash. Right? This isn't common. This isn't as common anymore. I haven't heard this in a while, but it's interesting. But you can when we try to expand compassion and we go, wait, no, but criminals are people too, and we really need to care for the criminals. Like, yeah, okay, that sounds like a good flag. That sounds like a good guy badge to polish. But the fact that there's any resonance with putting criminals away, that's fascinating. I think it's not coincidental that we're running into overcrowding in prisons in the same way we're running into overflow with landfills. It's the same phenomenon. And I think it's the same mechanism. It's actually exactly the same mechanism. If it's outside, if I make it go away, this magic of away, then I don't have to pay attention to it. And then I can deal with this other abstract fact of, oh, society has so many struggles. Okay. So I promise I will connect this back to the question of same-sidedness, but I want to make sure that this idea, this perception is clear. Right? Our default answer to things we don't like is to try to make them go away. That's not an inherent necessity, but it is a cultural standard. I mean, this is, you can see the same mechanisms if you're paying attention on the inside of your own psyche. When there's a, like if you have a bad habit, it's so telling that we have that language. We have a bad habit. Right? I'm a smoker. I'm not a smoker. I've never been a smoker. Everyone in my family dies like 20 years younger if they start smoking at any point in their lives. So just no. But I am a smoker. I've been trying to quit, and okay, if I've gotten to day 3, that's a good stretch. I think I've now quit smoking. I think I deserve a cigarette. Oh, God damn it! So there's this funny loop that we get into. And we go, oh, that's a bad habit. What am I going to do to deal with this? Well, I'm going to try to make the habit go away. And then a lot of the strategies for dealing with it is to go, yes, this is a bad thing for me to do. I acknowledge I'm going to not have another cigarette. No more cigarettes. Okay, and I'm going to stop buying them. I'm going to get that out of my life. I'm going to make it go away. Okay. What this does not address is what kind of role is the smoking playing in your life? What's delicious about it? Okay. Not just the rituals, not just the experience, although that's definitely included in it, but what are those doing for you? Okay. What is it about that process that draws you in? Okay. And closely relatedly, what are the experiences, the sensations in your body? What are the associated thoughts that trigger the sensations? What are the things that this helps you to make go away? I have this craving. Great, it's a sensation. It's just a body sensation. Why does the craving force you to rationalize and then go get another cigarette? Now, I want to acknowledge that a lot of the people who are watching this, I don't know what proportion, but I know that a lot, maybe most, maybe nearly all, don't smoke and have never smoked. So I'm trying to use this as just a common cultural example. But you can take just about any other example. I know one person who had to orient to this in terms of overeating, like binge eating. I know some people who've oriented to this in terms of, I dropped the example, what was that? Right, certain patterns of self-talk, looking at like trying to get rid of notice the language, trying to get rid of a habit of complaining. Right, I'm going to make that go away. Why was it there? Why did it grow? So when a person starts smoking, they start smoking for a reason. What does that fulfill? These are questions that by default we don't lean into and answer. Can I be with the intensity of the sensations that are involved in no longer making the sensations go away? This requires a mental strength. It requires an important mental strength. This is focusing on that second of the 4 points I was talking about. It focuses on that middle one, or one of the middle ones. Being able to, like, developing the capacity to be with any internally generated body sensation. How uncorruptible can you be? And if the answer is, well, not enough to quit smoking, oh, okay, cool, that's true right now. But you could build it up. You can build it up. It's just a matter of being with the sensations. Okay? So the reason this is important is because when you're facing a conflict with someone, the default thing that most of us try to do is make the conflict go away. I don't like this sensation of having this friction. I don't like the difficulty I'm encountering with this person interfering with what I want. And the focus is on, how do I make the bad experience go away? It's not that it's wrong to do that, and that you need to make the going away habit go away. Right? There's just loops. There's something very fundamental about how we're orienting to what it means to have a whole life. Okay? So I want to give a piece of my own personal experience of applying the direction I'm talking about. Around a year ago, my partner and I were having a kind of ongoing conflict. I think most of the details don't matter, but the essence of it had to do with a way in which we would sort of play a kind of unspoken, unconscious game. You could think of it as a pursuer-avoider dynamic, where I would try to I would feel some sense in which she would become emotionally distant, and I would try to get her to lean into the relationship, and she would experience that as a disrespecting of her spiritual experiences, and a way. And she would say, "I feel so sad that you don't understand that I'm right here for you," and I'm like, like, oh, no, I am supposed to understand and feel the fact that you are present, but I don't. I guess that makes me bad? Fuck you. And then there's a kind of friction that was going on back and forth. In order for us to get past that, it was necessary for me to lean into a recognition that I was trying, consciously, I keep emphasizing this way in which when you add no motivation, when getting away, when negative should type motivation ends up being a foundational thing for a psyche, it keeps shattering. So one of the effects of this shatter is a split between what, so for me this was experienced as a split between what I would consciously experience myself as trying to do and how I would think of myself, and the subconscious drive that would have me keep doing the same thing over and over and over again. Right? So consciously, my experience was of trying to lean in to make the relationship healthy, trying to sort out the difficulties in our connection, trying to see if she was right, and looking in myself and going, am I really just blocking her presence in the relationship? Am I the wrong one? Okay. But the emergent pattern was that I was the cycle I would go through was one of I'm trying to figure out how to say this without trying to go into all of the details of the interaction, just for time reasons. I would feel a sense of anger and frustration where she would say, it would feel like she was saying, I don't know why you feel like I'm so distant. It must be something with you. Right? And I don't know if that was actually her attitude. In retrospect, I think both of us recognize that there's something along those lines, but regardless of the objectivity, that was how I received a chunk of it. And then I would feel anger, like, oh, fuck you, right? And then this sense of, I'm not supposed to feel that anger. I need to make the anger go away. It would be very fast. Like, no, 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 the anger is going to lean into problems. She doesn't respond well to that. I need to adjust it so that I can properly manipulate her feelings in the way that the interaction works. Of course, I wasn't thinking about manipulation, but that's totally what it is. I'm trying to take responsibility for her reactions. That's always bullshit. Anytime you take responsibility for someone else's reactions, you're leaning into bullshit. Okay. So, and by the way, our culture hates that idea. It attacks it from a bazillion angles. It's amazing how much rationalization appears around this. That's probably worth its own conversation. How do you actually own your power and stop trying to manipulate people? But leaning into like so feeling that, I would then try to turn it on myself of, oh, there must be something wrong with me. How do I deal with this? Yeah, but what about this logical piece? Oh, I guess it's wrong for me to put that logical piece forward, but it makes sense to me. But how do And so I get caught in this loop, which would feed her sense of superiority and her sense that I'm being graspy and complicated, which would cause her to withdraw more. Right? So the way that I ended up cutting through all this is I sat down and I felt into the feelings in my body, and I thought through the loop, and I experienced it in detail, and I dedicated myself, said, no more bullshit. No more. I don't know the details here, but it's time for me to see this. It took a weekend of me doing this to sort it out, but in the end, I was able to have a direct conversation with her where I said, so I'm not interested in this game anymore. I keep leaning in this way, and I described my contributions. I said, yeah, I keep getting stressed, and then blaming you, and then withdrawing, and then blaming myself, and then getting tied in knots. And I think that doesn't let me see you clearly. Not saying, I think it doesn't let me see you clearly. I'm so sorry. That's more manipulative crap. Just going, yeah, I think it blocks my vision of you. I don't know who you are. But I'd like to. I'd really like to. Are you game for being seen? I don't want to do this game anymore. I'm done. And her response at first was a sense of, wow, that's sort of terrifying and intriguing and super sexy, and I'm okay, but I'm worried that you're going to think that I'm like not leaning in the right way, or like what's the game here? And I sort of looked at that and I went, I see. I noticed the invitation for me to stress about whether or not I'm interacting with you in a way that is smooth for you, and I'm not going to lean into that because that's part of the game. I don't want that anymore. You do what you want with this. I hope that you want to lean in. I would rather be alone than deal with this bullshit anymore. But I really hope that we can have a bullshit-free relationship. Okay. So, and that worked. It didn't have to. I couldn't know ahead of time. She might have decided, how dare you, like you're being aggressive and you aren't respecting my spirituality, and you awful person. And I go, oh man, that really feels bad. That really feels bad. Okay? I was prepared to handle that because I had just spent a lot of time feeling into, oh, these are just body sensations. They're not merely body sensations, they're not uncorrelated with reality, but they are ultimately just body sensations. Can I be with them? Can I stop trying to make them go away? That's the key question for me. Can I stop trying to make them go away and instead Fully experience them exactly as they are. Okay. It turns out that because she could feel my stability, it gave her room to do the same thing. And our relationship has immensely blossomed ever since. It had a lot of good stuff in it before, but it feels like it has exploded in a degree of depth and honesty that keeps building on itself tremendously. And there's also a clearer sense of individuality in our connection. We both being surprised and delighted to notice that when we make great personal strides in our own inner development, that it seems to be in parallel to the other person. We're not trying to make sure that we sync up, and we're not trying to be separate. It's just we are ourselves, and we keep finding we grow together. Right? It didn't have to be that way, but it happens to be so. So the essential question that keeps showing up over and over and over again is, can we say, this experience is present. Can I be in touch with it? Not, I don't like this experience. Can I make it go away? Okay, sometimes it makes sense to fix a problem. That totally makes sense. But can you experience the problem first? So the reason this ties back to same-sidedness, I hope you could see some glimmer of that in the story that I gave about me and my partner. There's a way where inside of our own psyches, in our interactions with other people, and in the culture as a whole, I claim that these are three scales of the same mechanism. It claims one mechanism over and over and over again. Everything that I've been saying this whole month, everything that I have to share is stuff that scales all the way down to the details of how your mind works on the inside and all the way up to how the entire species interacts. It's one game. It's one game iterated at different scales, which means that if you can sort it out in your own psyche, you can become the being that is capable of interacting with the world as it is in a way that helps it to transform into a way that it could be fantastically better for all beings, especially and including you. That's in broad strokes the game plan. This, I think, is a slightly anathematized version of Gandhi's quote, "Be the change you want to see in the world." But rather than believing it, you can actually just see it for yourself. So there's just getting over this mechanism of making bad things go away so that I can live in the good half of the universe. We see this mechanism, it's funny. I notice fear in naming any concrete examples about what culture is currently dealing with, because culture demonstrably has not decided to do, what I'm describing is what Carl Jung would have called shadow work. And we have not collectively decided to do our shadow work. It was shadow work that ripped Timothy Leary's group apart. It's shadow work and the failure to do deep shadow work, particularly the emergent collective shadow work, that keeps ripping apart or causing the passive aggression that becomes part of the culture of many nonviolent communication groups. So let me grab some historical examples, because what the thing I'm concerned about is triggering the reactivity. Like we're obsessed with ideologies today because we have lost track of where meaning comes from. That's its own topic. There's something very deep and important about the fact that we as a culture don't believe in religion anymore. We as a culture don't have a pathway to meaningfulness that we can just believe in anymore. And because of that, we keep manufacturing ways of making meaning. One of the most successful secular attempts at this was Nazi Germany. Right? There's a reason why it was infectious, and there's a reason why it was terrifying. Right? So we don't know how to make meaning, and we're sort of scared of meaning-making systems at this point as a culture. We're traumatized from it, which makes a lot of sense. We haven't solved that problem. And today, the way that most people try to solve this issue, well, I don't know about most people, but the way a lot of people try to solve this issue is they grab onto an ideology or a political movement that they can distract themselves with, that feels super meaningful and often has very important content. but there's a fervency, and but if you make me see the depths of this, then I have to look at the nihilistic pit, and I want the nihilistic pit to go away, so I'm going to ignore it. No one says that, but it's a common thread. So rather than digging into any of the modern examples, let me grab a few historical ones to point out how this works. I mean, so like Nazi Germany, it's part of how its meaning-making system worked was the claim that the reason that corruption was happening in the world is because of an evil other. In this case, the evil other, it was a collection of people, but the one that we most clearly remember in our cultural narrative of what the Nazis were about was the Jews, which is why they persecuted the Jews. The claim was that there was some sort of Jewish stranglehold on the power of the world and its financial flow, and that this was crushing the superior race of the Aryans, or it wasn't just an issue of race. It was a question. It was an idea of there being an ideal of a type of man built on the idea of Nietzsche's. I forget the term that he used for this. That Friedrich Nietzsche had this idea that there was a sort of idealized version of a person who had sort of grappled with the issues of nihilism and had come to being a self-making being. And the claim was that the German people were the heirs of this, and that they were being crushed by this evil other. So Nazi Germany could rise to make the evil other go away. Right. So it's an incredibly common mechanism. The same thing is what resulted in the Inquisition. The Inquisition of the Middle Ages. I don't know if that's properly called the Middle Ages. It was also like Renaissance and so on. But anyway, when the Catholic Church was Catholic churching, before the Reformation had really shattered it properly, and I think also shortly after, if I remember the timeline right, there is an issue of there being a way of collecting power in little pockets, and so being able to attack heretics and potential witches in order to undermine the local power structures. Right, so you deal with them by attacking them, destroying them, making them go away. Right. So the way that this keeps being the cultural solution keeps creating this fracture. So I think it's non-coincidental. I think I have to grab a modern example to highlight this. If you look at modern politics, the way that if you take somebody in the American left and the American right, you have a Trump supporter talking to somebody who's, I guess now it's going to be a Biden supporter. I'm not quite sure. There's a lot of shattering going on even within the supposed political parties. The parties aren't coherent anymore, which is a natural effect of the psychic shattering from chaotic times. But if you take a Biden supporter versus a Trump supporter, they might have a nominal discussion, but there's no way for them to do charitable listening. I mean, there is a way, but there's a strong cultural pressure not to. Right? The way that the narrative, I'm primarily surrounded by left-leaning narratives, and most of them emphasize how unreasonable Trump supporters are and how much they defy evidence and so on. It's not answering the question, why are they in support? Because they are stubborn. Okay, so why are they stubborn that way? Why aren't they stubborn the other way? What is it? What need is this fulfilling? This is like saying people who are smokers are just bad. They're wrong. They're stupid. They're not paying attention to the evidence. Okay, now that you have labels, what does that do for you? Right. So there's a very basic structural problem. There's a structural challenge. The same kind of thing showed up quite a bit earlier in debates around is climate change real? When the sides are on one hand, you're all coming up with this manipulative story in order to get political power, and this is bullshit, and here's the evidence that we see for how climate change is overblown, and this is some kind of conspiracy, maybe from China. I forget. I think that was getting touted for a while. I think maybe it was originally from Trump. I don't remember. It was some mimetic structure here, saying, there's like climate change is a thing here, or climate change is a political move, and it's an illusion. And then the other side saying, you're ignoring the science. Here is our evidence. So there's both claiming they have evidence on their side. There's evidence here, and you're not looking at the science, and look at all these scientists who agree, and you're ignoring that there's a real crisis, and we could all die if you don't pay attention. So this is analogous to a type of situation of if like on this side, on the side of this is like the climate deniers, which I think is this side's way of talking about this side. I don't think they call themselves climate deniers, but whatever their internal name is. There's a logic glitch, and there's a symmetric one, but I'm going to focus on this one for now. There's a logic glitch along the lines of if a parent is reading something in the living room, and then their toddler runs up crying, saying there's a fire in the kitchen, and the parent's response is to turn to the child and slap them and say, "Don't tell lies." There are so many things wrong with that picture, right? Either the infant is saying something true and it's worth looking at, or the infant's lying and or infant toddler is lying, and it's interesting to ask why. Why does the toddler need to lie? What caused the toddler to believe this? Right? So this impulse to make the toddler's objections go away creates a fracture that doesn't make sense. It's blocking information about the nature of reality. I mean, back in the original example, this would be the climate deniers, whatever they call themselves internally. I don't mean to disrespect people who hold this view. That's the point. Disrespecting is not a very useful function here. This point of view isn't doing something coherent with the other side. Like if they're in the world where there is no climate change, then it's worth asking, what is the pain that is causing so many people to fear the end of the world? Is there a way to meet them? Is there a way to help with this? Oh, it's a political manipulation. Why the need for the political manipulation? Is there a way that we can all have our needs met? There's a very stable way of asking that kind of question. Same thing on the other side. What is it about the climate deniers that has them ignoring the science? Because they're bad and stupid? Because they're scared? How bad of them. It's terrible of them to be scared. They should just get over their fear. Okay, great. Sort of like, okay, I'll just pull out my get over my fear button in my back pocket and push that. Like, what good does it do to yell at a child to stop crying? I mean, we're all children. We're just old children. So there's this, and I don't mean to mock the current responses either. I'm pointing out that there is a systematic glitch in seeing the whole system. Right? So the challenging part of same-sidedness over and over again is, can you listen to someone that you know is wrong? Can you listen to someone that you know is bringing in a twisted perspective, maybe even is trying to manipulate things, is being coercive? Can you listen to evil and recognize that there is no such thing as an evil so atrocious that it wants, that it actually reflectively wants to destroy its own values, and that we're all part of the same reality? There's a, I want I'm going to try to bring this to a conclusion, kind of tie this all together to point out what kinds of internal experiences, what kinds of shifts this involves. But probably the biggest challenge here has to do with, like I emphasize the word evil for a reason. One of them is that we tend to call the sides that we strongly disagree with some version of evil, even if we're not willing to use that word. The degree to which there is an attitude of, like I sometimes have seen the attitudes on both sides of the political spectrum, as though there's only one anymore, but we'll pretend in the United States, left versus right, as though that's still coherent, but we'll run with it, as though it would be good for there to be some deaths on the other side, because then political sanity could enter the realm. The point at which you are wishing the death of human beings in order for good to prevail is the point at which you are aligned with your own version of an inquisition. That is a loss of compassion. And that's not to say it to condemn it, it's to notice, how could you hold the truth of your own perspective without compromising it? And listen to the other. Is that forbidden? Is that totally forbidden? Oh, that's interesting. That's interesting. Why is it forbidden? It's important to make that evil go away. Okay. This gets especially challenging when we're dealing with things that just about everybody could agree are evil. There is a tricky conversation to have about this. Tricky exploration. Okay. That tricky exploration, I keep talking about this in terms of the dark triad. What do you do with actual clinical psychopaths, people with antisocial personality disorder? What do you do with people who actually have narcissistic personality disorder? Not just people who have some narcissistic tendencies, but the people who seem to have something different about their brains, such that empathy just isn't there. What do you do about Machiavellians? It's unclear whether there are clinical Machiavellians. This has been removed from the Diagnostics and Statistics Manual at this point. But the cluster B personality disorders are very tricky to deal with. And those two in particular, antisocial personality disorder and narcissistic personality disorder, are actively optimized for a hostile world. What do you do about them? What do you do about people who, regardless of having a glitch in their brain, have converged super strongly on organizing their entire personality around stuff like what you might find in the 48 Laws of Power, in being highly manipulative, in compromising their own sense of their own morality so that they can control the situation? What do you do with people like this? If you listen, if you're willing to work with them, they'll use the glitches in your psychology to coerce you into creating bad effects in the world. So what do you do? I think there is a potential answer, but it's not quite what you might expect. It really isn't what you would expect. I also don't claim to have a complete answer, but I am quite confident that the answer can't be to hunt them down and make them go away. As it turns out that those types of people are extremely good at manipulating systems that try to make people go away. So in terms of at least when not dealing with extremes, when you're dealing with when your friend turns into an asshole, when you're having trouble with your spouse, when you're trying to get groups to get along with each other. Well, you can't make groups get along with each other, but you can orient in your own mind with yourself. How can I orient to the other in a way that helps all beings flourish? Including myself. Including myself. You can't self-sacrifice here. That doesn't make any sense. If you can see in a deep way how you are interconnected, how Your ability to eat is based on the flourishing of the entire system that grows food and produces it and brings it to the grocery stores. If you can see how your mental and emotional health are intertwined with the mental and emotional health of all the people around you, it becomes very natural to notice that your true body and your true mind extend out to everyone. So your own well-being depends on the well-being of everyone. There's no you winning at the expense of others. That doesn't make sense. It makes local sense, but it does not make global sense. And if you can connect that as a direct perception, this opens up something very powerful, I think. One last thought. The kind of direction, I want to offer an analogy, a way of seeing the kind of direction that I think has a lot of potential, a lot of power for us as individuals and collectively. Throughout in our evolutionary past, some of our absolutely most ancient ancestors were multicellular blobs. Right? There's this whole progression going from like little strands of probably RNA to forming single-celled organisms, to single-celled organisms cooperating in little communities, sort of accidentally, mechanically, to them sort of lumping together and starting to form sort of primitive communication systems, probably based on chemistry, to the growth of specialized cells within that community that would, so you'd start to get things that would be the proto-version of nerve cells, for instance, that create communication pathways. But they're still basically communities. Somewhere along our evolutionary trajectory, there developed a sense of self that isn't any one of the cells. It isn't even a collection of the cells. It's something more like the organization pattern of the cells. Like, which cell or which cluster of cells is you? Right? There's something very curious about that. The fact that we can cycle through all of the cells of our body going, I forget exactly what kind of time period it's on, but certainly since you were a child, you've probably exchanged pretty much all of the cells of your body. Maybe some exceptions here and there, like some of the reproductive cells. I'm not quite sure what goes on with brain cells. But who you are is sort of built on top of the cells. You don't identify with any one of them or any particular cluster of them. It's more like you identify with the organization pattern of them, not consciously, but that's implicitly what's there. That would have been a curious transition. Like, the multicellular blob didn't have a sense of self, but you do. You're a complex multicellular blob. Right now, our species is in it is a kind of complex multicellular blob that has some internal communication, but it doesn't have anything like a central identity yet. I think what we're looking at is literally a collective waking up, going through that same transition, but for the human race. Now, that doesn't mean that there suddenly becomes this super intelligent thing that is the human race that makes you do things. I don't think that's how it would be experienced on the inside. There's a lot to say about how that would be experienced on the inside. And, but the upshot is that it wouldn't feel like there is this other being that is a superorganism that is taking care of you. That's currently approximately what we have, and that's a lot of why we run into trouble. What it would feel like is that you remember that you are existence. Right there becomes the center of consciousness. The reason that's important is because when I'm talking about same-sidedness, I'm talking about exactly the same thing. That is the knowing that it is a bad idea for you to cut off your thumb. It doesn't matter how much your thumb hurts. Right, approximately. If your thumb gets too infected, it might infect the rest of the body, and maybe the only solution at that point is to cut off the thumb. But it would be a tragedy, and you would be aware of that. not because of deep philosophy, but because you're deeply in touch with the integrity of your body. I'm suggesting that there is a way to be aware of the true fact that your natural way of talking about your body in the largest sense does not stop at your skin. You can see this, for instance, in the fact that you breathe, in the fact that you're listening to this right now. So, how do you be same-sided with yourself? Even with the parts of you that you really don't like. Okay, that's the key question. So, that's the main chunk of what I wanted to say for today. If I were writing this as a piece, I would look at it and go, I feel like there's an emotional arc that I haven't quite covered, which is something like, what does it feel like on the inside to really do the shadow work? What does it feel like to relax into, like to really own the darkness, to really own it? Right? To recognize that I am a monster. Why? Because there's monstrousness in the world. I actually have a lot of capacity for monstrousness. Right? To really own that. Right? There's a lot to say about that, and I wish that I had leaned into that a little bit. But I don't have a coherent way to loop back and touch on that. And I want to check to see, as I don't see any... Oh, how about that? It wasn't scrolling down. I thought people weren't saying anything. I can now scroll down and look at comments. All right, so let's see. Kai says, yay, managed to come follow live talk. Cool. David says, the other person might not be interested in the system as a whole, though, just themselves mostly. So what about that gap? So, you know, I have this phrase that for some reason doesn't quite connect for most people, but it seems so clear to me, and I haven't found a better phrase for it yet. So knowing that this won't connect for everybody, I'll mention it. It won't connect for most people, sadly. But the phrase is, cancer is bad for cancer. Cancer doesn't know. Cancer cells are not coherent enough to understand the consequences of becoming cancerous. So because of that, it looks to the cancer cell as though it is or to the precancerous cell as though it is an advantage, an evolutionary advantage to become cancerous. But that's a mistake. Because cancer kills the host that feeds the cancer. So it is a fact, analogously, that any entity that is harming the system for the sake of its own apparent gain is actually misunderstanding the nature of the hand that feeds it. So the question becomes, how do you deal with that? I don't have a universal answer, but I do know there's this dealing with it by trying to make those kinds of entities go away systematically doesn't work. It systematically creates problems like the beings that want to fight back. Like there's this basic issue that keeps showing up with psychopathy, the actual clinical psychopathy, where because psychopaths freak people out, like they have this idea of that person's annoying, I want to kill them, I want to kill everybody. Like there's this coldness, like just being able to say that, like, yeah, I tried to strangle my brother. And then you could look and say, oh wow, how did that make you feel? I said, I was happy about it, and I was annoyed when I was stopped. It's like this, like what? So there's something about the internal experience of a psychopath where the horror is not, it doesn't hit them at all, including other people's horrified reactions. So. Like a good way of approximating the experience of a psychopath is to imagine that you were actually immune to all negative feeling, and that had been the, like, not just immune, you were incapable of experiencing emotions like fear and guilt. Okay? Not just that you could ignore them, but they weren't even signals. There's no way to register them. One telling example of this was a sort of informal study done with some psychopaths in the criminal system. they were shown a bunch of pictures of people with varying emotional expressions on their faces, and we're asked, so what do you see here? One that really stuck in my mind was one psychopath who had looked at one of the pictures of a person who was scared. And he said, I don't know what you call this feeling, but it's the expression that people get on their faces right before you stab them. Okay, so if you have a punitive system that's designed to hunt down and isolate and shake their finger at people in order to get them in line, and that's what you use to deal with psychopaths, they can't understand why the system is doing that. In fact, they're going to have a hard time perceiving it. They just encounter difficulty, like suddenly people are pointing guns at them. That's inconvenient, right? So you have to do something fundamentally different if you're going to orient to psychopathy. Something really, really different in terms of orienting to psychopathy. And it can't come from condemnation, but you also have to be in touch with the horror of what it is that they do, right? So I think that there's a meaningful solution with this kind of question. But the solution can't be to say, oh, they're not interested in the quality of the system. No, it's that they don't have a bridge to understanding the quality of the system yet. Part of the game is, how do we build a bridge for all beings to understand this? How do we become the bridge for all beings to understand this? Trees are going to have a hard time understanding this. How can we help trees act in accordance? How can we become wise enough to answer that question? That, to me, is the interesting focus. Okay. Kai says, several of us might resonate with a Facebook, Twitter, email, etc. craving. Yes, yes, instead of smoking. Good point. Yes, Übermensch, that was the term, Übermensch. Uh-oh, you slipped into current events. Rupert says, but people should be swayed by evidence-based reasoning. They can't just ignore my very best efforts to show them the evidence. Yeah, I imagine that you're saying that not to object to what I'm saying, but to highlight an example of the thing that I'm saying. If you mean that as an objection, that's interesting. It doesn't seem like an objection. But yeah, insisting people should be swayed by evidence-based reasoning, should doesn't mean anything. This is something that our culture, I said this before, and it might be worth just having an entire live stream on should, because this keeps coming up. Well, we should cultivate discipline. Sometimes you just have to do things. Like this just keeps showing up over and over again. Should doesn't mean anything about the world. It is part of a collective hallucination. It is part of a shared psychosis, by which I mean a splitting from reality such that we don't see that it is a split from reality. That's what psychosis is. It is a difference between what our experiential reality is and what actual reality is. In some sense, all experience is psychotic, but meaningful psychosis where there's a breaking of the correlation. Right? Should is a hallucination. It doesn't mean anything, but it feels so real. That person should respond to evidence. Great, but they're not. That's what's real. Do you want to keep arguing with reality? Reality should be different. Great, what does that mean? It means I would feel better if they were to agree, and I expect results that are better. And there's a lot to unpack about what does better mean. But I expect better results if they were to listen to the evidence. Great, that's at least closer to truth. Right? But now you're going to shame them into agreeing with you? Oh, that works so well. So yeah, this whole business of people should be ready. Yeah, that's totally an example. I think climate skeptics is the nearest thing they have to a rallying point. Thank you, climate skeptics, yes. There is to me something very important about having a sense of honor and respect for all beings. Doesn't matter how crazy they are, in some sense. So what I mean by crazy, I'm actually referring to this psychosis business. Psychosis is, in some sense, a kind of spectrum, and it's a lot more common than we think. And what we call clinical psychosis is nothing to joke about. I'm using the term a little loosely, the same way that our culture tends to use narcissism loosely. There is a serious thing that is clinical psychosis, and I don't mean to dismiss that at all. But yeah, so there's something very important about not insisting that somebody has this sort of, like saying that because somebody has any degree of psychosis that I am capable of perceiving, they no longer deserve my respect. What it means is that they deserve your compassion. And the fact that they frustrate you is an issue for you to deal with. I know that has very little to do with what John is saying here. It just seems important to honor all beings, to actually honor all beings, not just get along with them and be nice, but to actually honor them. Remember earlier on I was saying that there are these two components, and I mostly went into the business with the shadow. There's this other dimension having to do with uncorruptibility. One key element of that is rather than trying to convey to the other person that you are same-sided, that you are trying to come from a shared perspective, that's less important than actually coming from that view. Maybe they won't understand you. Okay? But if you are actually coming from that view and you are trying to be transparent about what is real about you and about the situation, that will send higher fidelity signals of being same-sided than will trying to figure out how to convey that you are same-sided. It removes a dimension of what I referred to recently as Goodhart's law. The drift from value, because you're targeting the measure rather than targeting the goal. So that's part of why I think that it's important, regardless of what you think is true, to honor what people's experiences are, which is part of why I didn't want to just keep referring to them as climate deniers. So yeah, climate skeptics, thank you. Okay, or maybe if it isn't on fire, there will also be some, on some level of problem that isn't addressed in the kitchen as well. Yeah, talking about the example of the mother dealing with the child. Yeah, I agree. How do we know that such an evil does not exist? So I think you're holding, so so I think this is in reference to, I forget exactly what point of the conversation this was, but the reference to an implicit claim I've been making, which is that there is, how to say this? In theology, there is a problem called the problem of evil, which is if God is all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-loving, then why is there evil in the world? The answers, there are approximately 5 answers to this question. 4 of them correspond to one of those 4 properties is false. Like God is not all-knowing, God is not all-loving, God is not all-powerful, or there is no evil. And then there's this 5th one, which is God works in mysterious ways. Abandon thee thy logic, for this is the state of the world, and thou cannot understand. So there's like I don't need to lean on there being a demiurge or some kind of being that is like the God of the Bible to highlight this, but it seems like this is a common question that keeps showing up. Basically, I am claiming that evil is an illusion. Something like taking that 4th solution. There is no evil. But I'm trying to do it. There's a problem with the way that our current collective mimetic structures are set up, where we can't talk clearly about this. Because I don't mean people don't suffer, and I don't mean that there aren't forces that want people to suffer. There are sadistic psychopaths who like to torture people just to hear them scream. Okay? There are people who like to cause emotional trauma, not just because they're fulfilling some sort of wound in their being, but because it is thrilling. There's something weird about their brain relative to the rest of the population, where there's a lack of empathy and a delight in the capacity to feel their power. Sort of like the same way that a toddler likes the experience of throwing a ball on the ground and seeing it bounce. There's a way where they're wired in a way that gives them a delight out of watching someone get emotionally destroyed and feeling their lives getting tortured to death. Watching somebody watch their loved ones die hellishly and going, yeah, I'm getting a lot of fulfillment out of this. So like that's, there are people like this. I don't mean to deny that. And I don't mean to say that if we're going to use the term evil, evil doesn't apply to them. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that there is something systematically broken about the way that we orient to evil, such that we cannot address it. We systematically cannot address it if we orient to it the way that we have been. It is like noticing that landfills stink and saying we need to get rid of the landfills. Let's put more on them. Let's try to shove them down harder. Let's shake our fingers at them. It can't work. It's not addressing the reasons why the landfills appeared there in the first place. There are systematic reasons why. There is room for people to have the kind of orientation that results in them doing things that we would consider evil and heinous and horrible. And they do them in ways that are damaging. Like, it's a problem because it hurts. It creates difficulty for culture. It creates suffering. And that suffering matters. And they can't see the mattering and the way that the mattering actually echoes out into affecting them. So I am suggesting instead that the things that we're inclined to call evil are a louder version of the same things that we have in our own psyche, where we condemn our own habits, where we go, why am I such a bad person? Why do I keep slipping up in sticking to my habits? Like, I can't get a regular exercise pattern. What's wrong with me? Right? Well, like the laziness in you is your own evil. How shall you condemn it more? So what I'm not trying to make an ontological claim about reality. I'm trying to make a functional engineering claim about what we do about things that we call evil. And I'm saying that condemning them doesn't work systematically. And that the fact that we often only have condemnation and banishment as the answers to evil is part of why it's a recurring problem and is part of why our collective psyche is shattered. Not denying that it's bad, in terms of the way that we currently want to use the word bad. I'm saying that there is something broken about our collective and individual psyche's way of orienting to what bad means and what that implies about the use of compassion. If you cannot feel sorrow about the fact that the only answer we have to dealing with sadistic psychopaths is to lock them away or kill them, then you're out of touch with your full body. That's what I'm saying. Okay? I'm not saying that there isn't something horrendous about what they're doing as well. Okay, okay. So Brandon says, if you believe there exists an evil to that depth, then I think it would imprison you in a world where you can't have anything but this struggle. I went away for a minute there, not sure if Michael touched on any of that while I was gone. Yeah, well, there we go, I just touched on it. Kai says, now I'm thinking that back when people were more united by religion, etc., humanity had more of a collective self than it does now. Yeah, I assume you're referring to the side bit that I did about meaning. I think that's true, and I think that that collective sense of self was not capable of coherent thought. It's a little bit like my cats have coherent senses of selves in some sense. They don't think of they aren't multicellular blobs, or rather the way that they think of themselves, metaphorically speaking, they don't think of themselves. It's not exactly how it works, but they're to the extent that there is an experience there of a being that is experiencing, that being typically, for most cats, does not have the cognitive power to do science, to reason about, wow, I bet, so that light switch makes that light work, and I bet it's because of some sort of effect that goes on. Like, they can't do that. They might get the correlation, but the correlation is a magical fact about the world. They can't see the mechanisms of the world and reason about it. They can't cultivate what I'm calling wise knowing in any deep way that interconnects the world. So I think that the human race was in a state when we had widespread religions as our unifying forces, where there was more of a collective psyche, more of a collective coherence, and that collective coherence couldn't do science. It's telling that when we would develop the capacity for science, we destroyed religion. That's not a coincidence. Okay? So it was both a prerequisite and a necessary result in some sense. They sort of interlooped with each other, because we had to stop assuming that we knew the answers in order to explore what the answers to things were. And then as we explored the answers, we discovered that the answers that we had before didn't quite make sense in some ways. I think we're going through another iteration of this. The question is, how do we have a coherent sense of self with science? That's hard. Yeah, thanks, Michael, for the powerful stuff there. Yeah. Covering monstrousness next time, perhaps. Yes. David says, what does it mean to love cancer then? Yeah. At the biological level, I don't know. I think that it would be like one interesting potential cure for cancer. I don't know if this is how, I don't know if this would be possible, but if you could convey to every cell in your body what the consequences are and the meaning is of what it's doing for the whole system, I think that that might give, and if you gave cancer cells the ability to choose to become uncancerous, I think they would. Pragmatically, I have no idea how that would work. And my guess is that an idea somewhere around this area has probably been considered before. It might not be biologically feasible, but part of that is because this is why the stuff about wise knowing is so critical. Cells are not capable of wise knowing, at least not to the degree and the way that human beings are. Human beings are a novel thing in the universe in that we can understand and think about ourselves. We're capable of creating mimetic evolution. This is fantastic. It's immensely powerful. So I don't know what it would be inside of biology, because there's an essential component of compassion that we are capable of, where the analogy to cancer breaks down. What it would be for culture is, can you love and care for sadistic psychopaths without dropping the horror of what they're doing, without dropping the care and the action to protect their victims? Do you have to condemn one side of a conflict? And if you have to condemn one side of the conflict, we keep dropping right back in this same mind-shattering problem over and over again. So, yeah, so I don't know what the analog back in biology would be. Brandon says, lots of different ways to define love. One that probably doesn't work is, I love this because it provides me with positive things. Yeah, like a good business exchange. Yeah, that cannot work. Yeah, the definition of it doesn't fit for loving cancer. Yeah, the Greeks had at least 3 forms of the word love: eros, philios, and agape. Eros is like related to our word erotic, sort of eating, consuming, merging with. Like I love this food, right? That's eros, erotic love. Philios is where we have filial from, and I think I'd have to check the etymology, but I suspect that this is connected to the Latin root that also produced filial and family. Philios is sometimes called brotherly love, but it's like the love of family, the love of friendship and connection. Agape is the love that a parent has for a child. You don't love the infant because of what the infant can do for you. You don't love the infant because your loving the infant causes the infant to give you things. You love the infant as an act of fulfillment, such that your love going through you creates the environment that turns the infant into a human being. It is a transformational, miraculous form of love. So what I am talking about is agape. There's something that John Vervaeke, the cognitive scientist out of University of Toronto, he talks about the roots of culture and sort of what the mythic impact was of ancient Christianity. One of the main things that Christianity added to our sense of that it is possible to grow and evolve as people is the idea of participating in God's agape. God loves us into becoming more, and the way that that love happens, the agapic love, is by that agape passing through us towards the world so that we can participate in the evolution of the world. This is part of where the meaningfulness of Christianity seems to have come from. Those elements still appear in our culture. This is part of why we talk about love as the most powerful force. So I mean something that is love more like that. Yes, I would love more content about should. Noted. Kai says, I know someone who claims to be a psychopath. They've told me things like, sure, if someone gave me $1 million for killing you, then I'd probably kill you. But generally, it's much better to cooperate with people than make enemies. So at least some psychopaths appealing to enlightened self-interest might work. Yeah, I think secretly, so there's some fascinating research about what's involved in helping. They for some reason, they shy away from using the term psychopath for kids, which I don't know. Like, it's no matter what term you use for this, the problem is that the culture is going to keep calling these people evil. And so what we're trying to do is note, okay, there's actually a structural mental thing going on here. And the term for that is psychopathy or sociopathy or antisocial personality disorder. Okay. I forget the weird word games they're doing. And I think that part of this has to do with trying to get away from their own sensations of, oh, am I calling a child evil? Look, the child's a psychopath. That doesn't mean the child's bad. If you can't distinguish between those two, then that's the problem I'm pointing at. So when you're looking at psychopathic teens, there's some fascinating programs that have to do with the fact that psychopaths are not responsive to punishment, but they are responsive to rewards. So they are at a major, major evolutionary disadvantage because they can't plug into culture and they can't intuitively notice what makes sense to do and what makes sense not to do. They don't know how to care for the context that holds them. That's a major disadvantage, but they can't see it. So what a lot of those programs do, some of the most successful that I've ever encountered, which doesn't, they're not universally successful. It's like the kids who go through this program end up killing only, or no, sorry, they have no kills, which is interesting. They have no kills with respect to a comparison population, not a control, but comparison. But things like resorting to violent crimes, they're at like 1/3 the rate of people who don't go through these programs. And the programs are basically just based on providing firm walls, often literal physical firm walls, to prevent their negative behavior from being able to damage the system's ability to hold them, like the treatment system's ability to hold them, and then using rewards to entice them to do things that make sense in terms of caring for the system. And then eventually this opens up a conversation. So being able to recognize that psychopathy is actually a disadvantage for the psychopath. They don't even know how much they're hurting. They don't have a way of orienting. But you get hints of it in the way that many psychopaths will talk about how annoying people are. This is a very common reason that psychopaths want to kill people. Everyone's annoying. Why are they annoying? What is the experience that they're encountering that causes them to feel people are annoying? I suspect that there's a hint there that lets you bridge something fascinating. So the short answer is yes, I think that there's a way to appeal to self-interest, and ultimately that's all we all do. We're appealing to self-interest. It's just that there's a natural progression where if you take self-interest to its logical conclusion, you end up with caring for everyone. This is part of what I've mentioned before when I say when you actually understand why the Bodhisattva vow makes sense, why it is that you will not check out of the world until all beings everywhere are free of suffering. Okay? Why that makes sense. When you understand why it makes sense, you have already taken the vow. There's no promise you're making to anyone or anything. You don't need to. It's just an observation. Oh, that makes sense. Right, I just noticed I just devoted my life to this. But it's not what you think. It's almost certainly not what you think, because if you're scared of that, that means you haven't seen it yet, which is fine. Okay. John Purdy says, if you make any attempt to formalize the logic of how we speak and think about social interactions, you realize that half of it is couched in extremely complicated implicit models like should and approximate quantifiers like almost all. Yeah, I agree. It ends up being complicated, and I don't claim that we can make it all explicit and logical. But I think that there's something valuable about making explicit and logical what is there. I think that is doable. But yeah, I agree with you. David says, my question about the person uninterested in the system was sparked by the issue of assuming that everyone has the best interest of the system at heart in some way. It's still not clear to me how that would be a valid assumption. Cancer obviously does not. It might be in cancer's best survival interest to have the system's best interests, but it does not. Also, are you assuming that the best interest of everything is to survive/thrive? How do you know that to be true? Collective self regionally / etc., but not globally. Yeah, so I think you're asking good questions. It doesn't disturb me. Like, I don't feel like these questions are challenging what I'm seeing. It's having me notice what feels on the inside like a gap or an imprecision in something about how I'm saying it. This is a thing that deserves its own topic as well. I'm seeing a complex picture, and I'm trying to figure out how to compress it as a headline, because this could be its own thing. It'd be like its own 20-minute rant. The really short version I'll offer here, which I realize that may not sound like it's exactly answering your question, but I think it does. I'd have to sit and think about it to see, does this actually answer it? But I think this is the right area to look at. Excuse me. There's a kind of an intuition pump that a lot of people use when they talk about evolution, where they talk about what evolution wants or what evolution encourages. And in many ways, this is a little frustrating for a lot of scientists, because a lot of people will run with this metaphor a little too far. Like, humans are more evolved than chimpanzees, right? There's this frustration, because that isn't how evolution works. Humans aren't more evolved than chimpanzees. That doesn't mean anything clear to most evolutionary biologists. Evolutionary theory doesn't have a degree. But there's still a kind of intuition along the lines of, well, but relative to our ancestors in the environment we're in, we are more fit, so evolution kind of had a direction sort of like that, but the direction is more a matter of fit, and if the environment keeps changing, then the target, the quote-unquote target for evolution, will keep changing. That's part of why evolution is so powerful. It actually has the capacity to keep transforming biological entities, to keep refitting to a situation that keeps changing. So that's one important thing to honor. And at the same time, I think that there's a way where evolutionary biologists, when they have this objection, are being naive in a particular way. That naivety is about the fact that one thing that evolution will systematically select for is the capacity for a pattern, or a pattern cycle, when you're thinking of like a life cycle, to be capable of handling wider and more varying environments. That's why, like, in the beginning there was nothing, which exploded, and somehow we end up with this level of complexity. Like, that entire arc, the reason there's an increasing degree of complexity over time is because, not because complexity is inherently more adaptive, because what is more adaptive is inherently going to be more complex, because it's able to deal with more situations and has more cases and more maneuverability. It has more reactive functions. So in actuality, there is a general arrow to evolution. Right? And in that sense, because humans are capable of adapting to a lot more situations than chimps are, we are a better example of a manifestation of going along that trajectory of evolution's arrow. There are a lot of things that show up along the way that turn out to be adaptive at a given stage, but are also that also interfere with the capacity of continuing on that trajectory. Right? This is the essence of why I think the ego keeps showing up in spiritual traditions. The function of the ego is to keep you alive. It is a fantastically adaptive mechanism that uses your psyche. It uses the entire system that you want to call you in order to keep this alive. But evolution is a dynamic engine between two forces, the increasing invariance and a death force that kills off the things that are less fitting. And you need both of those to constantly be present in order to continue to have change happen over time, to continue to fit to the environment better. The thing that ego is trying to do is eliminate the death force. That turns out to be fantastically adaptive in a certain way, but it also blocks the capacity to increase variance of the types of things that you can handle. Another way of describing the kinds of things that we keep wanting to call evil are the forces that block your own growth, where growth is this kind of general trajectory for evolution. So what I am suggesting is that pretty much there's a nuance here, and it's possible that you're zooming in on the nuance, and I may not have thought about this in enough detail, but I don't think it defies my core claim. Most systems, nearly all systems, like cells, like humans, like trees, like the whole schmear, would want to be in alignment with this continuing growth. The challenge is when its own self-preservation runs into the fact that it needs to risk its own annihilation in order for the universe to continue growing, to continue the trajectory of evolution. That's where you run into some problems of friction. The issue is attempts to defy the trajectory of growth do not actually fulfill the function of long-term survival. They sometimes fulfill the function of short-term survival. Failure to see that systematically creates an incentive that creates the motive to make this mistake. Okay? So there's a kind of pop point, and what I'm hearing you note is, well, how does everything have an incentive to choose to be willing to choose to die? Like that's a core element, to choose to be willing to choose to die. Some things correctly are deciding not to do that because it's not in their selfish interest. What I'm suggesting is that there's a question of what is meant by self that ends up getting a little distorted. There's no way for cancer to get what it wants. It can sort of temporarily pretend to get what it wants, but each cancerous cell would have a better shot at having its long-term goals met if it were to not become cancerous. And so that's the kind of structure that I'm trying to highlight, that there's a level of insight about what kind of thing is happening on a universal scale, and the way that that applies to what's happening on an individual scale, that makes the move that is selfishness in defiance of the system that one is embedded in an incoherent move. The core issue is that there's a lot of pieces that are incapable of understanding that from where they are, which currently includes most humans. A lot of what I am trying to do here is create a mean that allows the human system to adapt to seeing this not as a claim, but as an insight, as something that can be directly perceived and corrected. Like, part of this is that I may be a little bit off. So I want to honor that there may be something that you're pointing at that I'm not, I'm slipping past. I can feel a piece of logic that I may be missing, and there may be a core issue here that's critical. But I still don't think the answer in those cases is to try to make those patterns go away. Even when you and another person are fundamentally at odds, like you both want the same person, and all of you people are operating under monogamy, and you're like, how do we deal with this? And we're in competition. Dealing with that subversively is systematically worse than having a tone of bringing the nature of the conflict to the middle and trying to sort out what makes sense in a global context for sorting that out. So I don't mean to claim that there's no such thing as an inherent conflict. I have as yet to encounter a really concrete example of this is an inherent conflict. And there's something interesting about the question of what do you do about inherent conflicts? I don't know. But I'm sure that casting shadow. I'm sure that trying to make, having each side try to make the other go away will not solve the issue. Okay. I like the question. It makes me think and has me chew and dig with it. I think it's important, and because of that, I'm going to take this away and chew on this. Brandon says, a concept that's helped me cultivate a love for all people is to think about dreams. I can have dreams or fights with people and arguments. And that forces me to think, since that's my dream, those others are part of me too. What good comes from trying to destroy or control them? Makes me question more the same kind of dynamics when I'm awake in reality. Yeah, if you encounter somebody you don't like in a dream, trying to destroy them, it might work for that moment, but why did they appear in your dreams? What part of you are you trying to ignore? Yeah, I like that thought experiment. John Purdy says, that does sort of touch on things like antinatalism. Are some beings better off not existing or never existing in some way? Yeah. What do you do if the answer is yes? Yeah, that's tricky. Brandon says, I think Michael might be implying that we are cancer unless we listen to him. I think he might actually be evil. This is a joke. So, like, there is a thing about so there is a thing to say here, to gesture towards the Gautama Buddha would and a lot of the things that came from his teachings. There's a whole lot of emphasizing. Actually, it's not just him. This also shows up in yoga, more of the Hindu stuff. And you'll see elements of this in Western spirituality too. It's a little less clear. It's not jumping to mind as clearly right now. But there's this thing about how one of the reasons to develop insight, to move towards a recognition of God or enlightenment or nirvana or whatever, is not just because it ends your suffering. This shows up particularly in Mahayana Buddhist threads. This question of how do you help alleviate the suffering of the world? As long as you are doing so from a position where you are suffering, you are actually going to, in general, tend to contribute to suffering. In order to bleed off your karma, you need to sort of have some orientation to knowing what you're doing. And if you can bleed off your karma, you can help bleed off the karma of the world too. That's a skill. Right? And basically, enlightenment is when you have, in this system, sort of like now, well, what's karma? Well, being looped into this tendency to be cancer, I guess. Being enlightened is having systematically ended your tendency to add karma. Okay. So I think there's something to that. I think it's fuzzy. It gets looped up with a whole bunch of questions of, and it's good to be enlightened. You're a better person if you do. It seems like something just broke when we're talking about that. I think there's a reason why a lot of people who are involved in spiritual traditions are very hesitant to say, oh yeah, I'm enlightened. I'm more enlightened than this person and less than that person. It's it adds social distortion that is made of pain, and it's unclear how to talk clearly about what those kinds of experiences are without creating more difficulty. But yeah, that comes to mind when you say that. There's something about how do we remove more suffering than we create? And David says, a simpler version of my question. How can we be same-sided to something whose only interest is to kill itself and as many others as possible first? Yep. So when I stare at that and I go, okay, my first gut reaction is, I don't know. I don't know what that hypothetical is pointing at. I have a gut reaction that goes something like, can we look at the example? I'm like, one of the objections I have to trolley problems and other ethical thought experiments. This is stuff like, okay, well, a trolley is barreling down a track, can't be stopped, and is going to kill 5 workers on the rails. And you can flip a switch to make the trolley switch tracks and kill only 1 worker. Do you pull the lever? And there's a couple of variations on this to point out interesting things about how we do moral reasoning. One of the reasons I find those kinds of thought experiments a little bleh is because, like, as interesting as they might and B, for diagnosing different aspects of how we do reasoning, I think a correct response, a very valid, correct, and important response is, how the hell did I end up in this bizarre thought experiment? This doesn't make sense. Why am I in control of the lever? Why are those people working on the track while the thing is barreling down towards these people? There's like, like that whole context, there's something very weird. So there, I don't know that you're a couple of minutes behind. I see your example. Let me just finish this side comment, and then I'll address the example that you gave there. So it seems it can feel real to talk about abstractions that seem to challenge structures, but and I think that it's important to be willing to talk about abstractions. Like, well, what do you do about these kind of moral situations? But often when we're talking about morality, this is sort of a shortcut to a particular kind of reasoning about the structure of the world. And in order to create thought experiments, we've had to sever off the context of everything else about our lives and everything about how things became that way, and just drop ourselves in this weird situation. And that matters. That affects the nature of the moral consequences of the decision being made. So, yeah, there's a whole lot of arguments about what we should do. Again, should doesn't mean anything, and this is one of the ways that we sort of create an illusion that should mean something. But it ends up creating this kind of weird distortion about how we reason about our own moral orientations. So David gives the example of cancer, right? So cancer's, so to point, cancer's goal is not to kill itself. Right? If cancer has a goal, like what happens is a cell goes, hi, I'm mutated. And I notice that if I pretend that I'm doing my job, but I just undifferentiate, then I can just eat everything forever. I can eat all the supplies that the body's giving me. And I can multiply, and this all feels great. It's all the growth stuff without the death stuff, and that means I'm evolutionarily advantageous. And I'm having a great party, and there's more of me, and woo, we're having an awesome party. Like they're immortal cells. They dump all of the extra work, and they're still getting all of the reward. So there's just this pure, I said to think of it like a party thing. If you could convey, hey, your party is going to kill you. If you don't do that, you get to survive longer. And it could understand, then it would go, oh. Right? So, and to me, the fact that this example is provides an example at a layer of abstraction, which is when we look at the details of each instance, I think that we often find that the abstractions that we were worried about don't apply, because it turns out that the details of each situation matter. And the details systematically tend to create a result, which is what I was describing before. There is a general trend toward all beings, all entities, all forms of existence, all swirls, if they could understand how to care for absolutely everything everywhere, would. I don't mean that this is a necessary fact about reality. I mean that it is an emergent trend that is in coherence with, it has coherence with this general trajectory of evolution seeming to have an implicit direction. And what that feels like on the inside, I think, is you care about yourself as the consciousness that is all of existence, and is remembering that fact, and is owning the fact that its true body is all of being. I'm going to want to wrap up here. I'm like half an hour beyond what I had originally meant to say. I'm going to stop here, but I found out about the comments late, so here we go. So David replies, what if the cancer became self-aware and still wanted to kill everyone? Example, people who believe life equals suffering equals immoral, therefore all life should be destroyed. Yeah, so I'm not going to grab the cancer example because the specific example in biology of the yeah, but I guess solving suffering would fix that. Yeah, that's exactly where my mind is going. I think that part of what's going on there is the addiction to away, the addiction to making bad experiences go away instead of cultivating a strength of being with. And the problem is that they don't have the resources needed to cultivate that strength or to cultivate the wise knowing needed to see that that strength is a good thing to develop. There's a term for this, by the way. It's called negative utilitarianism. It's the idea that on net, the universe produces suffering, and suffering is worse than the joy that gets created, and therefore non-existence is better than existence. So we should conspire to try to make sure that all of existence gets destroyed. Okay. I think that's completely knucking futz, and I think it is an error based on the fracturing of the human psyche. Okay, okay, so I'm going to call that wrapped up. Thank you all for engaging. And now I have a couple more topics to make sure that I dive into, that I'm excited to dive into. So I'll see about making a note of that. And yeah, thank you for watching. Thank you for your interest. Like, I enjoy talking about this stuff, and that's why I do so. To me, this is meaningful, and it's enjoyable, and it's thrilling to offer this and to see the interchange with people. So in an important sense, I am doing it for me, but I'm doing it for me because I get to see how this stuff seems to actually help people and inspire things, and the world that this might create or might inspire or might help to inspire, that's exciting to me. So you engaging with this fills me with a sense of meaningfulness that I really appreciate. Okay, I see a couple more comments here. Brandon says, by acting out by killing is to try to stop a perceived threat. If there's awareness, insight, connection, and so on, then a different orientation would form because by working together, a better life is possible. Yeah. And Kai says, to nitpick, negative utilitarianism claims that pleasure doesn't count in the moral calculus, not that suffering is greater than pleasure. Okay, great. Happy with that nitpick, in which case I would say negative utilitarianism is an example of the type of thing that I'm talking about. Okay, thank you all, and more to come soon. Cheers.